what I've observed and what data now shows, thank goodness, is that when women lead, change happens. If they're leading from their own power and not somebody else's definition of power. So that's my work now, is to get more women in power everywhere. And by in power, I mean in positions to influence and affect the lives of others. So unemployed on the streets of New York with overeducated for half the jobs and underexperienced for everything. I kept looking for writing and assignments, anything I could find. And someone who was in television at the time suggested that I try television, given that the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, remember that wonderful entity, which actually set quotas. I love to remind Americans that we have had quotas and that they worked. They had issued a governance ordinance for getting licenses to be a broadcast entity, and it included listing the number of women and minorities, as was called at that time. So given that information, I started calling the local television stations and suggesting that my background as an English teacher and a literature major and a short-time magazine writer might qualify me for some job in television, having no idea what the jobs were, having never taken a broadcast journalism course, having never been in a television studio except once when I was 12 for a jitterbug contest in my local town. That hardly counted. So I started knocking on doors and occasionally would get an interview or an audition, mostly because they really were seriously looking for women at that time, and was rejected by everyone. I went to a lot of cities. I was always too young, too old, too blonde, not blonde enough, not ethnic enough, too Southern, every possible excuse where I didn't fit the qualifications for the one woman position in the station, which is usually the way it was then. I was really getting down to my very last pennies, literally pennies. And with rent due in 2 days, I didn't know how I could stay where I was, and yet I didn't have a job, except I was moonlighting as a waitress in the restaurant on the corner, where I think everybody's had one of those waitress experiences, right? And I had a friend who was an artist, and I thought, well, I'll ask him if he'll loan me the money to have one more month. I just had a feeling if I could get one more month, one of these interviews for a television job might come through. And I went downtown in a pouring rainstorm, borrowed the money. He gave me the cash. I put it inside my purse and got into a taxi. And when I arrived back up on the Upper West Side in my apartment, I got out of the taxi in the pouring rain and left my pocketbook in the taxi. And as it drove away, I just said, well, there go all the dreams. I mean, everything was in it, all my identification, and most importantly, my rent money. So I went inside and told the babysitter and my 6-year-old son, let's start packing. We're going to have to go. We have 2 days to get out of the apartment. And the only thing I could think of is my mother's words, well, come home to Georgia. So I'm thinking, well, that's going to be the option. And the doorbell rang, and I went to the doorbell, and there stood someone who said, my name is Rabbi Goldberg, and I have your pocketbook. He had, I still get chills every time I tell this story because I can see him like it was yesterday. He had gotten in the taxi after me, and he had the good, he thought to open it, and he saw my driver's license, and it had my address on it. So there he was. And I, of course, just immediately burst into tears and was hugging him and, saying, oh, you just don't know what this means. And he looked me straight in the eye and he said, Patricia, at some point, everyone needs a rabbi. And tonight you got yours. And it was one of the most significant events, one of those times where you look back on it and say, had not this happened, how different would my journey have been? And my dad thought it was crazy. Being a military man who, everything had a plan, a strategy, an organization. And he just kept saying, all that education, and that's what you want to do? He was so afraid of television. He thought it was going to be the evil force in the universe. He may have been right, by the way. I don't know any woman in the world who is being truly honest with herself, who doesn't remember a time in which she felt like an imposter. Not because we doubt ourselves just naturally, but because everything in our journeys leads us to believe that we either got lucky, we stepped into the right place. We very seldom get that kind of feedback of, boy, are you really prepared? You've really got this. We can say it to ourselves a lot, but a lot of the time we're learning on the job. I certainly was. And there was a time, certainly in those first 6 or 7 years, when my life had changed so dramatically. I mean, I went from being a behind-the-scenes producer, writer, teacher to
creating some of the most monumental news and nonfiction programs in the history of the medium. And while she was at it, making sure she was smashing the industry wide open to women as never before, transforming broadcasting.
The celebrity out of all proportion living in Boston.
Pat Mitchell dove into television news to make a different kind of impact on the world. 1972, Boston, WBZ TV.
Because if you were on television in Boston, you were a celebrity. And having everything I've said and done talked about and watched and criticized and monitored and then going and covering political conventions and going to the front lines of conflicts, which I did. There were many times when I would think, God, what prepared me for this? Am I really going to be able to do this? And I think I overcame it the same way we all do, which is there's no choice but to just keep moving forward. So I made mistakes. I think that was just inevitable. And gratefully, I found a few mentors in those early days. They were really hard to find. You certainly couldn't find allies because women were encouraged not to be allies with each other, not even to become friends, not to talk to each other, because everything was about, we've only got one space, and if you want it, you better hold on to it. And eventually the 5 or 6 of us at WBZ and the other women who worked in television in that market, and there were more of us there than there were almost anywhere else in the country at that time. More of us working for that company. Oprah Winfrey worked for that company at the very same time in Baltimore. So we began a sisterhood that led eventually to that 1974 program we did, where we took over the television station for 24 hours. And women ran everything, did every job. We did a 24-hour program called Yes We Can. And it was Yes We Can, run cameras, direct news shows, decide what stories go on, do interviews, do live television. So we kicked it off with an evening, a big black tie evening event in Boston with all the politicians and everybody else, which I hosted along with a lot of high-profile women, Gloria Steinem, Liza Minnelli, Helen Reddy, who had the big hit song, I Am Woman at the time. And then the next day, starting at 7 a.m., we did a what would now be called convening, but I think we called it a women's fair at that time. And we had booths around the big, I think it was called Heinz Auditorium. I don't know what it's called now. But and every one was the different information booth for women. We had an on-site daycare center, which we had to close because it was overrunning with children and we were breaking the law. We had 25,000 women show up in the coldest day of the year in 1974, in January. The New York Times wrote about it. They called it the biggest groundbreaking event for women. And I often refer to it now when I hear women say, do we really need to do these women's conferences? Do we really need to have these places where we connect? It was incredible. And by the way, we had a protest by women, which again says a lot about the struggles we're still having as a global women's community. We were protested by the Gay and Lesbian Coalition, who literally marched in front of the live cameras with signs that had four-letter words on them, and stopped the whole entire thing. And the station, who were watching this all very carefully, and I'm sure thinking to themselves, see, we told you, women can't get along. Look, they're going to ruin their own event. Some of us got on the phone very quickly, and it was phones then, and called and said, don't stop the broadcast. We're going to handle this live. And I invited the leaders of the coalition, along with a fabulous Black woman lawyer named Flo Kennedy. I don't know if you guys remember Flo Kennedy, but oh my God, what a power. And Flo said to me, just invite them up here. Let's just have a conversation. So we did. And they came on the stage and we had an amazing conversation about what their concerns were and why they felt excluded from the event and what we needed to do about it. And it was an incredible hour. And then the rest of the program went on and they stayed. But when the New York Times reported about it, of course, that was their headline. Women interrupt other women or something to that effect. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was seen as a negative, where for all of us, it actually turned out to be a positive. It was really what we were trying to do. Can you believe that 1974? I bet we couldn't even do that. I'd love to see that, us try and do that again at some point. There were almost career-ending moments. One of them was I had just started my own talk show, and one of my guests was Dr. Eleanor Hamilton, who a great family therapist, who had been a guest many times on the show. And on that day, we were talking about aging and sex. And Dr. Hamilton just looked at the camera and said, the problem with people over 60 is they think they can't anymore. She said the word. And everybody went crazy. There's the control, but I could hear them screaming in my ear. What did she say? And we got in trouble because the FCC, this was before the days of the 7-second delay, which gave control rooms time to bleep things. There was no bleeping. In fact, Dr. Hamilton, she used to go around saying she was the reason that there was a 7-second delay. And she may very well be right, because the FCC came down and we had all these hearings and all kinds of things. And eventually we did get that 7-second delay in every control room I ever worked with in afterwards. But Dr. Hamilton also was just a great example to me of how plainly and clearly you need to talk about very sensitive issues. And she did that every time she came on the show. So I like to think we did some pretty groundbreaking program. One of them was was an abortion for which the station got picketed for months, and I was censored by the station, and because of having done an interview with Dr. Kenneth Edelin, who had been convicted of performing a second trimester abortion. Imagine, here we are back again. Well, there are lots of stories, and most of them I I haven't shared. The one that I think is the most typical of what happened to women, in particular, those of us who were on television, was that negotiating scene with my boss, suggesting that I'd get a better salary if I went to dinner and were kind and friendly, or whatever words he used. So that was and that contributed to my deciding to leave too, because in those days we didn't talk about it. We were silent. We didn't even share it with each other, because I'm sure it happened to the other women I was working with as well. He had always been a big advocate and a supporter, and it's the person who hired me, actually. And it had always been what I would describe as flirtatious and suggestive, but never direct, until that day. And it began by his telling me something about, talent on television is a bit like hamburger meat. The prices go up and down every week. So you just can't tell how desirable you're going to be. And the next month, it was clearly meant to make me feel very insecure and concerned about the negotiation. And as I was trying to make my point about all the reasons why I deserved the increase in salary I was asking for, that's when he said, well, this is really important conversation. Why don't we go to dinner tonight and discuss it? I have a hotel room at the Ritz-Carlton, and we can have dinner and have a late night conversation about your salary. So I got up and thanked him very much for the conversation and said I look forward to my agent will look forward to receiving his proposal. And in fact, it was a proposal which denied my increase. No surprise. Oh, I think I said something like, I can't have dinner. I work the 6 and 11 o'clock news, and kind of laughed. We all found ways to make it so it didn't happen. So they would feel okay that it didn't happen, and we'd feel okay. Yeah. And of course, I was perfectly lovely and nice and friendly from there anytime I saw him afterwards. I mean, what choice did we have? Quit our jobs, I suppose. The better choice would have been to have talked to each other and organized some sort of resistance. We would have saved a lot of other women from going through it. I was also harassed by everything from cameramen to news directors, usually with the suggestions rather than any actual physical touching or abuse, which I know happened to some too. So I don't want to belittle the fact that it was often much more aggressive than that. I took the job, I don't think, without thinking too much about what it would be to manage something other than managing my own company. At one time, I had 80 employees in my own company when we were producing Woman to Woman. So I'd run a company, and I certainly had run a budget for many, many years. But it wasn't anything like stepping into an executive job at a big company like Turner Broadcasting. When I got to Turner, there were lots of women there, but there was only one of them who had an executive title besides myself. And she was not very interested in doing anything to promote or elevate women, and I think looked at me with some suspicion in the early days, but I just kept after her because I knew I couldn't do anything without her support, and eventually got her interested enough to host a breakfast for the women at Turner. And it was just amazing how many turned out because they never talked to each other. We were all separated in all these different divisions, and every single one of them had a story of discrimination and a story of being passed over, looked over, salaries, so there was a lot that I had a chance, along with Julia, who ended up being a very important ally, because she'd been there a lot longer than I had, and she knew a lot better how to negotiate the politics. And I have to say, I had Ted's support. I guess it comes in two parts. One was watching my mother and all the women that I knew in my small town live these very unfulfilled lives, very boxed in by what was expected of them and what they thought they could and could not do. And then being told over and over again, growing up in that small town, you can't, no, you can't be a lawyer, no, you can't run for office, no, you can't do this. And trying to find things I could do. If there are journalism students who still believe that reporting the facts matters, come out of these schools prepared to fight for getting it back, because if we don't get it back, we're going to lose the democracy, not only in this country, but everywhere, because it is essential, as we know from everything we've ever seen in the world, that you've got to have a free and open and truthful press. My hope is that in these journalism schools, which seem to be full of smart, enterprising young people, that they will start to reclaim the role of journalism in a free and open society.